continue our study of 1 Samuel. We're in chapter 19. We're going to try to cover 19 through 21 today, but I have some doubts as to how far we'll get. Interesting, and again, we're going through a very interesting part of the history of Israel when we're dealing with the transition from Saul's kingship to David's kingship. And we talked a little bit last time about what these represent, what Saul represents, what David represents, what Jonathan represents. And we see, you know, there's many different meanings to this. There's a lot of symbolism in all of this, but in general, we can clearly see that Saul is representing the efforts of the flesh, right? The fleshly aspect of existence, certainly the fleshly pursuit of the nation of Israel, whereas David, in contrast, represents the spiritual aspect, God being in control, the Holy Spirit leading them, and so we see a constant conflict. And what we've been seeing in these last few chapters we're going to read again today are the efforts by Saul to kill David for no good reason. You know, we see that what has David done to bring any harm or disrepute or anything negative about in Saul's life? Nothing. Everything that David has done has been positive and has brought benefits directly or indirectly to Saul. Nevertheless, what is Saul's reaction to all of this?
He's jealous.
He's jealous. Jealous to the point that he wants to kill David. And what we see in this is something that was apparent and becomes apparent in the life of Israel really from this point forward. And it has been from this point earlier. And that is the efforts of the flesh to dominate over the spirit. And in that we see not only a clash that's going on in the life of the nation of Israel, but something that occurs in every single human being, the constant clash between the flesh and the spirit, and the efforts of the flesh to overcome the efforts of the spirit working in our lives. That's something that we have to be vigilant of and diligent about really every day, don't we? That tendency we have to put confidence in the flesh, which we shouldn't do. The whole purpose, the whole purpose of circumcision, which became the sign of the old covenant. Circumcision was what? As Paul put it, we are the true circumcision who worship in the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus and put no confidence in the flesh. The history of mankind has always been the tendency to put confidence in one's own flesh and in the flesh of other human beings. And God says, no, don't do that. Do not have confidence in your own flesh or anyone else's flesh. All of your confidence should be in me. Trust me, and I will lead you. So that's what these lessons are about. That's what this history is about, the struggle between the flesh and the spirit. And then we have Jonathan, who's an interesting character because he's kind of in between the two, right? Jonathan is a son of the flesh. He's a son of Saul, right? But what is his relationship with David? Friendship. I mean, it's more than friendship. He loves him like his own brother. I mean, they're in a covenant relationship. They truly love each other in a pure, sweet, brotherly love type of a circumstance. So much so that Jonathan will even turn against his father, or will try to convince his father, leave David alone. David is about doing God's will, and he tries to keep Saul from pursuing David. He's not successful ultimately. But we see Jonathan, who he wound up dying in defense of his father at the very end. We'll read about that history later on. But nevertheless, Jonathan, I think his motives are good, and in my view, what Jonathan may represent, I think he represents, if we fast forward to the time of Christ, we know that at the time of Christ there were Sauls existing at that time, were there not? Mm-hmm. Sauls, those who were trying to put the David of that time, Jesus, to death, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. But there were also Jonathans at that time, weren't there? There were sons of the flesh who were mindful of who Christ really was, right? Sons of flesh, Jews, certainly the disciples, even Nicodemus, even Joseph of Arimathea, you know. They were leaders of the time. What's that?
John Baptist, possibly.
Sure. All of those who were sons of the flesh, if you will, those who were born of Israeli blood, but whose eyes were open, who saw, yes, the Christ, he is the promised one. He truly is the Messiah. Many of them rejected Christ in his way. Some of them didn't.
But even the Samaritan woman.
Yeah.
So there were others.
True enough.
So when you call those people believers?
Yes. Yeah. I don't know they really represent Jonathan because they weren't sons of Israel, but certainly they were those who were influenced by the Spirit.
Okay.
All right. So let's read some more of the travails and what's going on as between Saul and David and Jonathan. Jack, let's start with you, chapter 19.
Saul told his son Jonathan and all of the attendants to kill David.
Pause right there. See, that's not a small thing, that first sentence. Saul told Jonathan and his son, of all the servants, to do what? To kill David.
And that's a command. Right?
Yeah,
From the
right.
king.
Yeah. And why does Saul do that? Has David done anything wrong? Anything that's worthy of death? Certainly not. But again, this is what the flesh does. The flesh wants to quash all the work of the Spirit. And this is reporting history to us, but it's also reporting part of human nature to us, what the flesh does. All right, read on.
But Jonathan was very fond of David and warned him, "My father is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and I will tell you what I find out." Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, "Let not the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you. And what he has done benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great victory for all Israel, and you saw it and were glad. Why then would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason?" Saul listened to Jonathan and took this oath: "As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death."
All right, pause right there. So what do we see? We see a complete reversal here. First, Saul orders, put David to death. And then Jonathan comes to him and says, "What has David ever done to you? He's done nothing but good." And so he purports to change his mindset. He says, "Listen to him, as the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death." How long did he stick with that? Not very long. Yeah, about 2 minutes, that's right. But, what does that tell us? We think about our own struggles. How often do we struggle between the flesh and the Spirit? And how often do our fleshly desires quell or quash the work of the Spirit within us? It happens in subtle ways. Sometimes they're not so subtle, but often very subtle ways.
Well, with Saul, it started with just a comment about how David has killed
Yeah.
many. But
Yeah. Yeah.
it was just a remark.
That's right. It was pride. It was something that he wasn't put down. He just wasn't lifted up as high as he wanted to be lifted up, right? The women are out there singing, "Saul has killed his thousands." Say, that sounds pretty good, but David's killed his 10,000. Oh, wait a second, I deserve a higher place, don't I? So
Well, it started as a little seed.
exactly.
It wasn't anything huge.
Mm-mm. No. But it works. It works like that, and that's the way. That's something that is going to continue to affect all of us as long as we walk in this earth.
That's right.
So we must constantly be on guard. And part of what this is about is David, who was really not trying to do anything except the right thing, but he had to constantly be on guard for what? He was trying to follow the leading of the Spirit, right? That's what David, at least at this point, we're going to see that as we get a little bit farther along here, he gets drawn off track. He takes to some line and he gets fearful. But at least at this point in his life, he is being led by the Spirit and he wants to do what God wants him to do. But nevertheless, he is being pursued by a madman who wants to kill him. So he's having to learn lessons of vigilance, right? He's having to watch out for what? For the wiles of what the flesh is going to do to him. And we need to do the same thing. And particularly when each of us, when we feel the call of the Spirit, you better watch out, because as soon as you feel the call of the Spirit start moving that direction, the flesh is going to be after you. Saul is going to be after you in a heartbeat. He's going to be flinging his spears at you. Why? Because that's just the way we are. All right. Juan, do you want to pick up from, was it verse 7? Yeah.
So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. Once more war broke out, and David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled before him.
All right, pause right there. All right, so everything is cool between David and Saul. They come back and they hug each other, and David lives in the house and he's playing the harp and he's soothing Saul. But then war breaks out. David goes out and he has just a tremendous victory. And Saul ought to be thinking, great, I sent my best warrior out and he was totally victorious. He ought to be happy about David, right? But he's not. What happens? Read on.
But an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand. While David was playing the harp, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with his spear, but David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape.
All right, pause right there just a second. Again, we talked about this last week. What is that a foreshadowing of? Saul trying to pin David to the wall with his spear.
Crucifixion of Christ.
Yeah, exactly.
I always had trouble with that. But an evil spirit from the Lord came upon Saul as he was sitting.
same thing.
Yeah. And that particular phrase appears, we've recounted that 4 or 5 times already, haven't we? And we're not finished with it.
16:23 as well, because
Yeah.
it said evil spirit from God came upon Saul.
You think, why would God flame an evil spirit upon Saul?
Mine says injurious spirit.
Yeah, injurious, yeah.
Well, it sounds almost like Pharaoh, you know, God hardened it. He said, y'all can go, and then God hardened his heart, and
I think he turned him over to his desire.
Yeah. I think that's what it is, you know.
And to do his plan,
Yeah.
God's plan.
And when was it that God, what we've read before is that God, you know, the Spirit of God was with Saul for a while. I mean, when the Spirit of God came upon him, it said he became a new man. He became a different person. But then what happened?
It left him.
That's right, why?
He rejected it.
That's right, he rejected it.
God's
He
spirit.
sacrificed, yeah.
That's right. God gave him a specific task to do, unambiguous task. Go wipe out the Amalekites and kill their king. Wipe out all their livestock. What does he do?
Saves the
Teach the
best.
best.
Yeah.
For himself.
He saves the best and he brought back a trophy, right?
Mhm.
He brought back a trophy to show, look how good I am. The victory was not God's, the victory was mine. And God says, you've blown him. So he withdrew his spirit from him. Why? Not because God initially rejected Saul, but because Saul rejected God. And then as Lon said, you know, when you reject God, then you know, you're kind of left to your own devices. And I don't think it was so much that God intentionally put the evil spirit on him as if he withdrew his protection and he allowed Satan to afflict Saul the same way Satan afflicted Job, right? And so we see that, you know, every time I read that, I have the same question. That seems strange. Why would God allow that? But God will do that if we reject him. If he gives us a specific instruction and we intentionally disobey him to bring glory to ourselves and not to him, you better watch out.
But as Ann said from that very beginning of Saul, he started his doubt with the Lord. He was wishy-washy.
Yeah.
I mean, just when you're killing him next, your son comes and talks to him, you're not killing him, then you're sending him out, you know. So Saul never came back to the Lord. He would almost come back, but never.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And it's interesting here. The metaphor is a very good one. Here is David, a foreshadow of Christ. He goes out and he wins the great victory to bring about salvation for Saul and for Israel, right? And so what does Israel do? They try to pin him to the wall. And that's exactly what the Jews did. Jesus came to bring back great victory for them. What did they do? They pinned him to the cross. All right, read on.
Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and to kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal led David down through a window and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent the men to capture David, Michal said, he is ill. Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told him, bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him. But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, Why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped? Michal told him, he said to me, let me get away. Why should I kill you? When David had...
All right, pause right there just a second. So here we have, again, the appearance of Michal, who is Saul's second daughter. And remember how Saul used her to draw David off track, sort of dangling the bait. And you can see here, there's something in this, even though Michal helps David, she sees the value in what he's doing. She sees the evil in what her own father's doing, the flesh is doing, so she makes a way for his escape. But we see also something's going on in her life. What does she have right there with her?
Idol.
Yeah, she has an idol. It's one of these translated as teraphim, and it's right there. And this particular one, and I did some reading about this. Who else in our history had a teraphim like this?
Abraham?
Rachel.
Or Rachel,
Rachel, yeah. Remember, in fact, she stole it from her father and she hid it away. And it's interesting. Part of the custom was these teraphim. They could be small little things, or in this case, what it appeared to be was like the bust of a man, like the head and shoulders of a man. And it said that what these things were is they were regarded. They're called teraphim, or household idols. They were things that were worshipped. But a lot of times, what a father would do is he would give a daughter or a son one of these things, which was an image of the father, and it was evidence of the right to inherit. And it's even referred to in the account of Rachel that she wanted to get these things as it was evidence of her right to inherit from her father. So anyway, what this is telling us here is that she has one of these idols in the household, which would have been an abomination to God, but it was there to do what?
Protect David. At that time,
At that time-
used for that.
Right, that's right. But at the same time, it was also there to draw David off track, because he was allowing something to occur, to exist in his house, which was an abomination before God. One of these earth idols. What did you start saying?
So are we assuming this was,
Questions.
are we assuming this was maybe a bust of Saul
Could have been.
that he gave for the house?
Could have been. And it could have been like a glorified version of him. It was something to be worshipped, but it was also evidence of her right to inherit from him. So again, that sort of implies that she is still an affectation of the flesh. And we're going to see later on, as Wanda pointed out, that she really she does become a stumbling block to David later on. And recall how that is, Wanda.
She despised him in his heart because he was singing and dancing before the Ark of the Covenant when it was brought back into the city,
That's right.
into Jerusalem.
That's right. She's basically denigrating. He's celebrating. He is so happy that the Ark of the Lord is being brought back, and she says, "You just made a fool of yourself." Why? For celebrating that you're so joyful that they're basically bringing God's presence into the city, and as a result of that, she was cursed. How?
She was barren.
She was barren. She never bore a child.
So explain verse 17 when she said her quote, "He said to me, let me get away, why should I kill you?"
Mm-hmm.
So is she just saying that to protect herself?
Yes.
I think she is. I think she's saying there that basically Saul
threatened
said,
her.
"That's right. Why did you let David go? He's my enemy. I want to kill him." And she says, "Oh, he threatened to kill me." She doesn't say it directly, but she says, "He said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death?" So it's basically she's saying, well, I was threatened. I was fearful that he would kill me if I didn't protect him. So she gets a pass because of that, at least temporarily. All right, any other comments on that section? All right, Brother Kenny, pick up where Wanda left off.
When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. Word came to Saul, David is in Naioth at Ramah. So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying with Samuel standing there as a leader, the Spirit of God came upon Saul's men, and they also prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent men a third time, and they also prophesied. Finally, he himself left for Ramah and went to the great cistern at Sekur. And he asked, Where are Samuel and David? Over in Naioth at Ramah, they said. So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came upon him, and he walked along prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off all his robes and also prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay that way all that day and night. This is why people say, is Saul also among the prophets?
Pause right there. What does that tell you about what's going on in Samuel's presence?
The Spirit of God is moving.
The Spirit of God is moving in a mighty way that everybody who comes around is prophesying, meaning what?
Worshiping?
They're worshiping, but they're also, in this sense, prophesying, I think, is just declaring the Word of God. So they're declaring God's goodness. I think they're worshiping. I think they're praising God. And everybody who comes around, what do? They immediately go into praising God. Even when Saul comes there, not only is Saul praising God, but it says that he stripped off his robe. And I think some translations say that he lay down naked. I don't think he stripped off all of his clothes, but I think what he did is he took off his implements of war and his kingly, his robe, the vestments of his office, if you will. In other words, he humbled himself and he lay down. And it is said by some scholars that this was basically his last chance, that the Spirit of God came upon him. He recognized who he was. He threw off his kingly garments and he laid down. He prostrated himself before the Lord. And, it's like God, even though he's done some very evil things, God's going to give him one more chance. And, of course, what does he do? He blows it. But again, I think this shows us that God is a merciful God. Even someone who is as evil as Saul was at this point in time, and despite the fact that Saul had rejected him, God gave him one more chance.
But I think that was also the way that God chose to protect David at that time too, and show his power and protection over David.
That's an excellent point. That is a very excellent point. Because what does that tell us? That tells us as long as we're being led by the Spirit, we shouldn't be concerned about the flesh because God will take care of the flesh. That's a very good point. And I think we see that theme pretty universally here, is that God will, as long as David is doing what God wants him to do, God is the one who's fighting the battles. He's fighting the battle of the flesh and every other battle. Good point. All right. Chapter 20. Who's next? Kathy, you want to read?
Pass.
Nancy, you want to read for us? Chapter 20.
David fled from Naioth in Ramah. He came before Jonathan and said, What have I done? What is my guilt? And what is my sin against your father that he is trying to take my life? He said to him, Far from it, you shall not die. My father does nothing either great or small without disclosing it to me. And why should my father hide this from me? Never. But David also swore, Your father knows well that you like me, and he thinks, Do not let Jonathan know this, or he will be grieved. But truly, as the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, there is but a step between me and death. Then Jonathan said to David, Whatever you do, I will do for you.
All right, pause right there. Mine says, whatever you say, I will do for you. Is that what yours says?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Verse
Whatever
4.
you say, I will do for you.
Yeah, that's okay. All right, pause right there. This is very interesting because Jonathan, again, he's the man in the middle. He's got the flesh over here, his father, okay? He's the son of his father. He's supposed to be loyal to him. He's the heir apparent to the throne. But then over here, he's got David, and he recognizes the good of David, and he recognizes the evil of his father. So here's a man, and that's why I say, in many respects, Jonathan represents the concept that Jesus spoke of to Nicodemus when he said, you must be born again. Jonathan had been born once of the flesh of his father, so he was a man of the flesh. But he is now in the process of being born again. In what sense? That he recognizes the value of the Spirit, and he recognizes the operation of the Spirit in his life. And verse 4 is a very important moment in his life where he says, Jonathan, this man in the middle, when he says to David, whatever you say, I will do for you. And this is a pledge. This is something that we all must go through in the born-again experience, is recognizing the value of Christ and the leadership of the Spirit. And we should say to the Spirit, whatever you say, I will do. And at the same time, that is a rejection of the leadership of the flesh. But a very important thing.
But it was so hard for Jonathan to be in that position because he would have been the one to be king, and yet he put that aside
Yeah.
as part of his friendship for David and recognized that David should be the one to be the king.
Yeah, that's right. And that's no small thing either. And bear in mind, at this point in time, it is said by some scholars that Jonathan was probably about 40 years old. David was probably about 20 years old. Saul is probably getting close to the end of his life. And so Jonathan is he's just right on the verge of becoming king and inheriting everything. And so that's quite a prize that's standing before him. But that makes this decision all the more significant, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. He's looking at the inheritance. It's like when Jesus said, when Satan said to Jesus during the temptation, he says, just fall down and worship me, and all this is yours, right? That's basically what's laid before Jonathan. The whole kingdom is yours because I'm going to give it to you. And what does Jonathan do? He does the right thing. He rejects that, and he says to David, he says to the Spirit, he says to Christ, whatever you say, that's what I'll do. Read on, Nancy, please, ma'am. Verse 5.
David said to Jonathan, tomorrow is the new moon, and I should not fail to sit with the king at the meal. But let me go, so that I may hide in the field until the third evening. If your father misses me at all, then say, David earnestly asked leave of me to run to Bethlehem, his city. For there is a yearly sacrifice there for all the family. If he says, good, it will be well with your servant. But if he is angry, then know that evil has been determined by him. Therefore deal kindly with your servant, for you have brought your servant into a sacred covenant with you. But if there is guilt in me, kill me yourself. Why should you bring me to your father? Jonathan said, far be it from you. If I knew that it was decided by my father that evil should come upon you, would I not tell you? Then David said to Jonathan, who will tell me if your father answers you harshly? Jonathan replied to David, come, let us go out into the field. So they both went out into the field. Jonathan said to David, by the Lord, the God of Israel, when I have sounded out my father about this time tomorrow, or on the third day, if he is well disposed toward David, should I not then send and disclose it to you? But if my father intends to do you harm, the Lord do so to Jonathan and more also, if I do not disclose it to you and send you away, so that you may go in safety. May the Lord be with you, as he has been with my father. If I am still alive, show me the faithful love of the Lord. But if I die, never cut off your faithful love from my house, even if the Lord were to cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. Thus Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, may the Lord seek out the enemies of David. Jonathan made David swear again by his love for him, for he loved him as he loved his own wife.
All right, pause right there. So again, we see the commitment, the covenant that's made between Jonathan and David. And again, it's a covenant between Jonathan, the son of the flesh, the born again, and it's a covenant, it's a commitment to David, the leading of the Spirit, the foreshadow of Christ. Why is there's all these discussions back and forth between Jonathan and David about, David saying, well, how are you going to know? How are you going to be able to tell me if Saul really wants to kill me? In other words, if he's crazy or if he's sane, if he's changed his mind, am I going to be safe? If I come back, why is all that exchange going on there? What's the benefit to us in that?
Just let us know where you'll have doubts.
Yeah, it's the idea of running these things through one's mind to be prepared for the attacks of the flesh, right? Because, again, as we said before, and as we all know, when God taps us on the shoulder and says, I've got a task for you, I want you to go do this, that's when the flesh is going to attack us most mightily. And so all of this, the discussion between Jonathan and David about what Saul is going to do, it's to prepare us, to ready us when we're of sound mind, if you will, when we're not afraid. We should be thinking about, all right, what am I going to do? What are the possible impediments that are going to be thrown in my way? And they'll be very personal things. When God calls you to do something, Satan will work in a very personal way. He knows you pretty well, and so he's going to use your flesh or the flesh around you to attack and try to throw stumbling blocks in the way of your following God. That's what this is all about. It's the admonition to each of us to be prepared, because that's going to happen. And what are you going to do when it happens? so we don't get caught off track.
So Jonathan recognizes that God was with his father,
Yeah, that he had been.
that he had been.
Uh-huh.
And so at this point, he's recognizing that his father is no longer with God.
I think so.
I think too, he recognizes God's with David all the way since Goliath. And I think that much as David didn't want to hurt Saul, Jonathan recognizes that, David really is
Yeah.
representing God.
Yeah.
That's why.
Yeah.
The love was strong, for that reason.
Yeah, and I just got to believe that God's Spirit working in David, just that's something that Jonathan recognized, and there was a real attraction for that. It was not so much the attraction of Jonathan to David, it was Jonathan's attraction to the Spirit of God working within him. That's
Well, I
really
think God recognized Jonathan and was
Oh, no doubt.
using Jonathan in this situation too, to
Yeah.
be the person who David had
right.
through the
Absolutely, absolutely.
I think-
That's right.
If you notice, Jonathan asks that David will look after
His family.
his family.
Yeah.
And I think that's God blessing Jonathan in a way that is, lineage would
Yeah.
go on.
Yeah. And we'll read later on that David does in fact honor that vow, doesn't he? Because even after Saul is killed and after Jonathan is killed, they have a son with a strange name, Mephibosheth, I believe it was. David, showed mercy on him, didn't have him killed, and so he's fulfilling his vow too. All right, where do we leave off? Johnny, you want to read your pass? Kenny?
Not thanks.
All right, Terry?
Then Jonathan said to David, "Tomorrow is the new moon festival. You will be missed because your seat will be empty. The day after tomorrow, toward evening, go to the place where you hid when this trouble began, and wait by the stone Ezel. I will shoot 3 arrows to the side of it, as though I were shooting at a target. Then I will send a boy to say, 'Go find the arrows.' If I say to him, 'Look, the arrows are on this side of you, bring them here,' then come, because as surely as the Lord lives, you are safe. There is no danger. But if I say to the boy, 'Look, the arrows are beyond you,' then you must go, because the Lord has sent you away. And about the matter you and I discussed, remember, the Lord is witness between you and me forever."
Other powerful words there in verse 23. Jonathan repeats, "The Lord is between you and me forever." He really believes it. Go on.
So David hid in the field, and when the new moon festival came, the king sat down to eat. He sat in his customary place by the wall, opposite Jonathan, and Abner sat next to Saul. But David's place was empty. Saul said nothing that day, for he thought something must have happened to David to make him ceremonially unclean. Surely he is unclean. But the next day, the second day of the month, David's place was empty again. Then Saul said to his son Jonathan, "Why hasn't the son of Jesse come to the meal, either yesterday or today?" Jonathan answered, "David earnestly asked me for permission to go to Bethlehem," he said. "Let me go, because our family is observing a sacrifice in the town, and my brother has ordered me to be there. If I have found favor in your eyes, let me get away to see my brothers." That is why he has not come to the king's table. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan, and he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of the mother who bore you? As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send and bring him to me, for he must die."
All right, pause right there. Verse 31 is a very powerful verse too. It says, Saul tells Jonathan, "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established." Powerful words. Meaning what, metaphorically?
Christ has to die.
Well, And yet Christ has to die, but he says, as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, the son of Jesse being a foreshadow of Christ, right? But as long as he lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. And that is, as long as Christ is in control, the flesh will never have dominance. You see? And it's interesting here because we're seeing that Saul at this point, he's been against David, right? The flesh is against the spirit. But it's interesting here, when Saul turns against Jonathan, what does that tell us? That eventually the flesh will turn against the flesh in order to defeat the spirit. So the flesh is always going to be at war with the spirit. But when the flesh sees that the spirit is prevailing, the flesh will be against the flesh. Wow. You think that's suicidal? Yes, it is. But that's just how desperate things will get when the spirit dominates. And we have to be on guard of that too, that our flesh will set traps for itself to prevent us from walking in the spirit. All right. Warren, you want to read? 32.
Why should he be put to death? What has he done? Jonathan asked his father. But Saul hurled his spirit at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David.
All right, pause right there. So there we see evidence of the flesh turning on the flesh, all right? Saul is turning on his own son, his son of the flesh. And so Saul, in destroying Jonathan, is basically destroying himself, destroying his fleshly line. But he's willing to do that. He's willing to go to any length to defeat or to prevent the spirit from having success. Read on.
Jonathan got up from the table in fierce anger. On that second day of the month, he did not eat because he was grieved at his father's shameful treatment of David. In the morning, Jonathan went out to the field to meet with David. He had a small boy with him, and he said to the boy, "Run and find the arrows I shoot." As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called out after him, "Isn't the arrow beyond you?" Then he shouted, "Hurry, go quickly, don't stop." The boy picked up the arrow and returned to his master. The boy knew nothing of all this. Only Jonathan and David knew. Then Jonathan gave his weapons to the boy and said, "Go carry them back to town." After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times, with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have a sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to town.
It's interesting in verse 41, again, you see this strong affinity, this strong love between Jonathan and David. At this point in time, David knows that it's over with. There's got to be a parting of the ways. And it says that Jonathan was sad and wept, but David even more. Why was David more upset with the parting than even Jonathan was?
Because he knew that was his only true friend. The only person that he could really count on to help him.
Yeah, I think that's right.
But Jesus wept.
Yeah.
He was sad when he saw Jerusalem, because look what's going to happen, and he was sad for he was sad that I think that Saul is lost in the flesh, in his.
But and along that same line, I think David is upset because at this point in time, Jonathan could have just said, "I'm done with Saul. I'm done with my dad. I'm coming with you. We're gonna be buddies forever." But Jonathan basically made the decision, "No, I've got to stay here." And then I think that grieved David terribly because by making that decision, it was in essence a decision against David. Even though he didn't disavow his love for him, he didn't follow him. Okay.
Just like Jerusalem,
Exactly. Yeah. All right. Umpire, do we have time to adventure in chapter 21?
Depends on how far you want.
Okay. Get that red flag
You got
ready.
5 minutes.
All right. Who's our next reader? Sarah, you want to read? Okay. Tommy, you want to read chapter 21?
I'll let Ann.
Ann, you want to read for us chapter 21?
David went to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, Ahimelech trembled when he met him and asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" David answered Ahimelech the priest, "The king charged me with a certain matter and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about your mission and your instructions. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find."
All right, pause right there just a second. All right, so David, he comes to Nob and the priest, and evidently this is where the tabernacle was set up at the time. We can kind of glean that from what we see here, because we know what's there. The showbread is there, the ephod is there, and it appears that the tabernacle has been set up. So the priest says to David, "What are you doing here?" And what does David say? He says, "The king has commissioned me with the matter and has said to me, 'Let no one know anything about the matter on which I am sending you and which I have commissioned you.'" Was David telling the truth there?
Maybe unless it's the heavenly king.
Well, David, I think, is telling the truth. The king, right, he's really referring to God, that God has sent me on a mission. But at minimum, if David he's not telling the whole truth here. At least he's trying to mislead the priest, isn't he? And so we see here that David is slipping to some extent because he's trying to mislead. Go ahead.
I think he may have been trying to protect the priest in a way too, because if Saul comes and chases him, Ahimelech can't tell him what he doesn't know.
Yeah, but I think
True.
David is human and he's protecting himself.
Well,
He's doing
he
what he has
is,
to do.
but he's trying to protect others too,
Yeah.
maybe.
And
That's
he's
not
gonna,
his first time.
no,
telling the truth.
No, that's
No.
he's going to see later on that telling that, or at least in his own heart, he says, if you look at the very end of chapter 22, he says, "I have brought about the death of every person in your father's household," because as a result of what David does there, all these priests are slain and everybody in the town is slain. So, in what we see here, I think, Wanda could be right, but I also think that David was trying to be misleading here. He wasn't telling the whole truth. And the reason I say that is we're going to see later on in verse 12, it says something about David. It says, in verse 12 it says, "And David took these words to heart." This is when he's with the Philistine king. And it says, "And David greatly feared the king of Gath." Now, this is something that has not been a part of David's character up to this point in time. He has not been fearful. Now, he's been cautious in dealing with Saul, but when he faced the Philistine, was there any fear in his heart? None at all. He was totally fearless. He was bold. But I think what we see here is that David, he's kind of backsliding here. And so when he goes to the priest and he says, "I'm on a mission for the king and I want some bread." And so what happens? Read on.
But the priest answered David, "I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here, provided the men have kept themselves from women." David replied, "Indeed, women have been kept from us as usual whenever I set out. The men's things are holy, even on missions that are not holy. How much more so today?" So the priest gave him the consecrated bread, since there was no bread there except the bread of the presence that had been removed from before the Lord and replaced by hot bread on the day it was taken away.
All right, pause right there. Now, this was a very strange thing. As far as this priest knew, David was just an ordinary guy. Now, true enough, he had been called by God. He had been ordained by God. But David and his band of men were basically unknown to this priest, I believe. And so it is a very odd thing for David to go in and be asking for bread and for the priest to give him the consecrated bread, because, we know about, when you walked into the tabernacle, you had the three pieces of furniture there, right? You had, what was on the left?
The altar?
No, the lampstand was on the left. Directly ahead was the altar of incense, and on the right was the table of showbread. And the showbread was there. These fresh loaves of bread, 12 loaves of bread were placed there, showing basically the presence of God, a foreshadowing of Christ, right? The bread from heaven. So anyway, this was a very holy thing, not to be shared with ordinary people. But David goes in, he asks for it, and he eats it. And so this is a very odd thing. But it's so odd that even Jesus himself referred to this, remember? In fact, Jesus refers to this in an account in 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record Jesus talking about this. Who remembers that?
The apostles were walking through the fields and
Yep.
they were eating wheat on the Sabbath, I think.
Yeah. They grab some wheat and they're eating it. And what happens, the Pharisees point to him and say, you're breaking the commandments. Why? Because the commandment says you don't do any work, and particularly you're not supposed to either plow the ground or harvest on the Sabbath day, and you're harvesting on the Sabbath day, shame on you. And what does Jesus tell them?
You reference back to
Yeah, that's recorded in Matthew 12:3, Mark 2:25, and Luke 6:3. Let's look at Mark 2:25. I think that's maybe the best one, but let's look at that.
What is it again, Mark?
Look in Mark 2:25, Mark chapter 2, verse 25, if I wrote that down right.
You did.
Okay, Mark 2:25. You got it, Jack? Did you read something?
Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? This is Jesus talking. In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is unlawful only for priests to eat. He also gave some to his companions. And then Jesus said, the Sabbath was made for the man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.
So why does Jesus use that strange account there of David going and eating the bread to make his point here?
to break down the religious rights or something.
Yeah. Yeah, what else?
I thought David was by himself in this situation.
Well, he wasn't. He hasn't been with it.
I think,
Oh, he did?
But yet, he says that, I was gonna ask you that, why do you think he was so shocked that he saw David alone? And is that because David's royal family, or because he's in the army, he would have people with him, you think?
I think because he was in the army and would usually have people with
But
him.
would you
Yeah.
classify him wasn't he Saul's son-in-law at this time?
He
He
was.
was.
So he's part of the family. So I was wondering if Entourage went with him, because there's obviously no social media, news don't travel that fast.
No.
You know, that's Saul's
No
family.
Facebook back then.
Right, right. So I'm just saying, in a day or so, this priest would not know that.
Yeah.
The Sabbath,
Maybe the priest recognized him as a fugitive from Saul,
Yeah, I don't
or
know,
whatever, whether he was just totally alone
Or-
without the accoutrements of
unless it is a royal
Saul's.
family and they always
the
have
Sabbath was made for
servants
God.
or something.
Yeah.
The Sabbath was made for God.
That's
It was
right.
a day of rest for him.
Yeah. And the whole idea, the whole idea says the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And of course, what Jesus is trying to do, he's rebuking the Pharisees for what? For saying, you have broken the law. And was Jesus breaking the law when he got some food on the Sabbath day? No. Why? Because Jesus was going about, he was doing his Father's business. And he said, even in this circumstance, he says, basically saying, you know that David ate the consecrated bread and nobody criticizes him. Even you guys are not pointing to David saying, you broke the law by doing that. And why is that? Because you knew that David was a man after God's own heart. So he said, you're basically missing it. What's that?
He was doing God's work.
Exactly.